Three of the principles which metaphysicians discuss and debate and sometimes use, applying them to give a good ontology, using these principles to figure out what exists in this universe, are bundle theory, Leibniz law, and PII. Leibniz law is also called the principle of the indiscernibility of identicals. PII is also called the principle of the identity of indiscernibles. And you can tell from the names that one principle is the other in reverse, or to be a little more precise, in converse. Now, let's do bundle theory first, but let's contrast it with the theory of substance. So my stapler, I've used this stapler illustration before. Let's use this rook. This rook here has some properties. It has the property of being made of marble. It has the property of being a sort of greenish tan color or something. It has the property of being greater in height than 1 inch, and the property of being less in weight than 10 pounds, and so on. These are its properties. Now, a normal way of thinking, which John Locke, for example, will employ, is that in order to have these properties, there must be a substratum, something underlying the properties, something which has the properties. If there's nothing there to have the properties, then how, I'd like to know, does the rook have properties? How can there be any properties if there's nothing there to have them? That's the substance theory. That's what John Locke thinks and various others. Now, in Locke's way of articulating it, if you explain every property of the object, if you list all the properties, if you study all the properties, you will have listed every possible way we have of knowing the object, and that means there's nothing left by which we can know the substance. The substance is unknowable, imperceivable. Its very nature is unthinkable. We cannot know anything about the substance underlying this rook. We can only know about the properties of the rook, but the substance is there. Otherwise, what is it that has the properties? Thus, saith Locke. Now, a natural response to this is, if we can't know this substance, if it's unknowable, unthinkable, imperceivable, incomprehensible by nature, why should we believe it exists? Just toss the whole idea out and just recognize that the rook is its properties. There's no substance underneath it. It just is the properties, and that's all it is. Now, that's the bundle theory. Bundle theory is the theory that an object is just a set of its properties. And in the history of philosophy, bundle theory emerged in British empiricism in reaction to Locke. First, Berkeley applied bundle theory to physical objects, such as the rook here, saying there is no physical substratum underlying it. Philanus, in the 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philanus, referred to the Lockean idea of substance as an inconceivable somewhat. And you can see why perhaps he would reject this idea. Why believe in an inconceivable somewhat? We know the properties. Just say that that's what's real. The properties are what's real, and all we should say is real is what we know. And we know the properties. We don't know the substance, so there probably is none. Then Hume comes along, and Hume applies bundle theory to the mind as well. Berkeley recognized a spiritual substance or mental substance. Berkeley recognized the mind existing as a substratum of our thoughts. There is no substratum underneath the rook, but there is a substratum underneath our thoughts, and the mind is a substance. But Hume came along and applied bundle theory to the mind as well, saying the mind is just a bundle of psychological properties, as the rook here is a bundle of physical properties. Well, that's bundle theory. Let's do Leibniz law first. Now let's do PII and Leibniz law together. PII, the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, states that if any x and any y have all the same properties, then they are identical. Leibniz law, the converse, states if any x is identical to y, x has all and only the same properties as y. Now let's phrase this differently. PII states if any 2 objects are distinct, if they're not identical, then they can be distinguished by their properties. If any one thing and any other thing are not identical, then you will be able to tell them apart, because one will have a property the other lacks. And Leibniz law converts that, saying if any 2 objects can be distinguished by their properties, then they are not identical. Now, these principles are perfectly consistent. And in Leibniz, they go together. You have one principle and the other, and they work together. And that's a fairly natural way of thinking. Leibniz law is non-controversial. Pretty much everyone accepts it. And in the Leibnizian way of thinking, if we take Leibniz law, we say, no, it has no false positives. Every time it tells us that there's a difference in properties and therefore a difference in identity, it's always right. But according to PII, Leibniz law has no false negatives. Every time it tells us that there is a difference in properties, every time it fails to tell us that there's a difference in properties and therefore a difference in identity, there is no difference in identity. Anytime X and Y seem to have all the same properties, they are also exactly the same object. That's PII and Leibniz law working together. But some accept Leibniz law and not PII. PII is controversial, although Leibniz law is not. To understand the controversy, we need to be aware of Max Black's article on the identity of indiscernibles. Black posed one of the greatest thought experiments ever posed by a philosopher. He asked us to imagine two spheres in a universe which is empty except for the spheres. Imagine a universe containing two spheres of exactly the same size and exactly the same shape. And imagine there's nothing else in this universe. One sphere and another sphere located at a certain distance from each other. Now, for convenience, because we have a hard time talking about two spheres that resemble each other with absolute perfection, we pretend that they have differences in properties. Namely, we pretend that one is named Castor and the other is named Pollux. And so they are distinct. One lacks the name Pollux and one lacks the name Castor. But really, they have all the same properties. It's only a fiction. According to the contours of this thought experiment, they have no names. Referring to them as Castor and Pollux is a comfortable illusion, a way of referring to them more easily. Now, in this thought experiment, we're told that they are distinct spheres. One's over here, one's over there. We don't know which, but one's on one side of the universe and the other's on the other. And yet they have all their properties in common. Accordingly, PII must be false. And with it, bundle theory. It's important to understand bundle theory entails PII, because if there is no substance underlying this rook, then all the rook is its properties. And so if something is all and only those properties, it has to be the same thing as this rook, because that's all there is to the rook, just the properties. Bundle theory entails PII. So Black's article is meant to show us that PII is false, and with it, bundle theory. And so there must be some sort of substance. So Black is pushing us back towards Locke and away from bundle theory. Now, Black has been very influential, and a number of metaphysicians have followed him or responded to him, and it's easy to identify two major streams of thought in response to Black. First, the pro-Black stream. To name some, there's Dean W. Zimmerman, there's Robert Adams, and there's Richard Swinburne. They all follow Black in thinking PII is false, and with it bundle theory, and there is substance. The other main stream is the pro-bundle theory stream, and these philosophers will find a way of trying to defend bundle theory despite the counterexample of Castor and Pollux. So in this tradition we have, to name just two of them, John O'Leary Hawthorne and Albert Casuyo. Casuyo suggests, although he says more in the article I'm thinking of, one of the things he suggests is that PII might be a contingent truth but not a necessary truth. That is to say, it might be true in this world that any distinct objects can be distinguished by their properties, but maybe it's not a necessary truth. Maybe it's not true in the world of Castor and Pollux, but in this world you will always be able to find a property distinguishing two objects. If you list all the properties of these two rooks, they don't have exactly the same color scheme, but if hypothetically they did have exactly the same color scheme, let's try the other ones. If these two rooks turned out to have exactly the same color scheme, you would still be able to distinguish them by their properties. They don't exist in the same place. One's in my right hand, the other's in my left hand. And even if you could use really precise instruments to find they had exactly the same shape, size, weight, and color, you would still find that they were in different places. So they could be distinguished by their location or by their relational properties, like one being left of my nose and one being right of my nose. So in this world, you can always distinguish two distinct objects by their properties, but maybe PII is not a necessary truth, but it's a good enough truth for this world. It's practical, it's useful, it's never let us down on this planet or in this universe. Good enough, says that particular philosopher. John O'Leary Hawthorne has a delightful little response to Max Black's counterexample, which is surveyed along with Max Black's article on the articles playlist on this channel. O'Leary Hawthorne says, well, if you consider the nature of universals and recognize the existence of universals, not transcendent Platonic forms, but immanent universals within this world, the more Aristotelian conception of universals, if you acknowledge universals, you realize that these properties of Castor and Pollux, their being spherical, their property of having such and such a color scheme and having a certain diameter and so on, all these properties are just universals, and universals exist in more than one place. So a bundle of universals can exist in more than one place. So Castor and Pollux are the same sphere existing at a certain distance from itself. Universals can do that. So can bundles of universals? Well, this is the second stream. This is the pro-bundle theory and pro-PII stream of thought. There's a third alternative, which is to say that bundle theory is false. There is such a thing as substance or essence or both. There is, let's move to a different piece. There is a substance or an essence to this night underlying the properties of the night. And PII is still false. Now, if we're going to take this route, in response to Castor and Pollux, we might be able to go a modified Kasuya route and say PII is contingently true and bundle theory is false. But another route suggested by Karl Vaught, whose article on the subject is also surveyed on the articles playlist on this channel, another strategy suggested by Vaught is more the Leibnizian strategy, which is to affirm PII and reject bundle theory, affirm Leibniz law and PII, and say that the essence of the thing, or the substance of the thing, can be known. The essence is not an inconceivable somewhat. Differences in identity make a difference. Differences in identity make a difference. That's the Karl Vaught strategy. Now, it's important to understand that certain essential properties are recognized by, if not everyone, at least rather a lot of metaphysicians, as making a difference. Certain aspects of the essence of a thing are recognized as making a difference. On a fairly standard way of thinking about essence, the modal properties, or the possible properties of an object, are properties that are part of the essence. Well, the essence of a thing contains all and only its possibilities. The possibilities of a thing are constrained by its essence. And so when you list a possibility open to an object, you're describing some aspect of its essence. And it actually does seem to be possible to distinguish two things by their essence. That is to say, to apply Leibniz law to two distinct objects. And Descartes may err in some things, and most of us think he does err in something or other, but Descartes has an interesting argument for the non-identity of the mind and the brain. And most of us think either that it's a good argument, or at least that it's not crazy, that the general idea of reaching this conclusion, this kind of conclusion by these kinds of premises makes sense. Now here's the way the argument goes. The mind can exist apart from the body. The body cannot exist apart from the body. Or the mind can exist apart from the brain. The brain cannot exist apart from the brain. Or the person can exist apart from the body. But the body cannot exist apart from the body. Therefore, person and body are distinct things. Mind and brain are distinct things. Now, there's a lot in Descartes. There are other aspects of Descartes, other if you scour his writings and try to find every single argument for mind, body, non-identity, you will find different ones. But this is one of the things you will find in Descartes. And it is a distinguishing of mind and body, of person and body, of mind and brain by their essential properties. And that means that with Leibniz law, we are knowing the essences of these things. We are distinguishing things by their essence. If we can do it for Leibniz law, why shouldn't we do it for PII? That's the alternative way of thinking of this, Karl Vought's way. Call it the Leibnizian way. There's the Lockean way, the Humean way, or the Leibnizian way.